welcome to part 2 of Icon, the empowering invitation of the cross. Now, we're looking at this series particularly coming up to Easter because I think it is something that's helpful to remind those of us that say, yes, we follow Jesus, that's a part of our life, to remind us of the one icon that shapes how it is that you and I live. And for the world that looks in at us, and for those of you who are saying, I'm not quite sure whether I'm there with my faith, or you're still trying to figure out what faith means to you, the importance of the cross is something that changed the trajectory of all of history, and it changed my life personally and others as well. And my hope is as we head into Easter, we remind ourselves that it's because of Jesus on the cross that we even have the faith that we have today. Without the cross, Jesus was just someone with good words or who did some good things. But because of his death and then his resurrection, we have new life, new hope, and a new way to live. So, we're coming up to Easter, and one of the things which I'm very much aware of in terms of, for many of us who've been Christians for a long time, or for those who have been part of the church for a long time, is that the cross represents, for many people, this idea of believing. Because of the cross, I believe. It's all about believing, about thinking right, about making sure that you know what's right, you think what's right. And at the end of the day, the cross is just, well, I believe, and that's what I do. But when we look at the early church and we look at the people who were closest to his death, to Jesus' death and resurrection, what we actually see is that the cross represented a new way of living, a different way of living, a new way of experiencing the life that they had. You see, the world looked at Jesus' life and said, what he said is really good, but we just want to add it to what we're already doing. Or people looked at how Jesus elevated the status of women, of children, of the marginalized, and went, we love that, but we want to add it to what we're doing. But the cross stands as a reminder that Jesus didn't come to add to the way that our world operates. He actually came to get a new way of living started. He came to stand against what was and introduce something that was brand new. So the cross stands as an invitation. It's an invitation not just to believe some things about God, but also live the way that God designed us to live. So what has happened over time, and some of you might find yourself agreeing with me over this next little bit. Some of you might go, oh, I'm not so sure about that. But what I've experienced and what I've seen is that as time has gone on, something interesting has happened. You see, the cross has been taken in Christian circles and reduced to, well, if you just believe the right thing and you just say a prayer one time, then you can go back to the way you're living. And it's almost like in the past, Christianity was sold as this idea, if you believe the right thing, you say the right prayer, and you act a little bit better than the people around you, which basically meant don't swear and try not to drink, then your life is set. Keep going the way you were going. You don't have to readjust anything because you now believe in Jesus. And culture saw that, and they went, you guys look like us. Like, you guys maybe don't swear as much, that's cool. But other than that, like most people who say that they follow Jesus, at the end of the day, they seem to act and behave like me. And I'll tell you this, right? And don't tell other Christians I say this, but when we reduce following Jesus down to believe the right thing and pray one prayer and move on, at the end of the day, we're just being lazy. Now, this is not a salvation issue. I'm parking that to the side right now. Some of you are thinking, is he talking about salvation? No. Believe in Jesus and salvation is assured. But don't operate in the way Jesus calls us to live. And it's like sitting in a parked car and you're sitting there ready to go, but you don't ever start the engine. You're in the car, but you haven't used it. So when Jesus died and came back to life, he didn't just say, believe in me. For them, they believed. They were like, oh my goodness, you were dead, now you're alive. Belief checked. But what challenged them was the fact that Jesus then went one step further and said, it's not just about belief. I'm giving you a new way to live. And I want you to follow me. And that's where we get a bit cross. I'm not talking about salvation, but what has ended up happening, and it happens in my life as well. Don't get me wrong, I'm not perfect. But what ended up happening is that people said, believe and pray a prayer, you're fine, live your life. And what happened to the cross is it actually got relegated to basically just being a good luck charm. I'm going to wear it around my neck, I'm going to look at it every now and then, but it's basically just gets reduced to a good luck charm, which is not what it was intended to be. So to catch you up with where we are in our series, last week we started off by talking about striving and success. Striving and success. And we talked about the idea that we find ourselves quite often in life racing to the top. The top of what? Who knows? But we're going there and we're trying to get there as fast as we can. We want to be the best. We want to have the most success in our career or in our family or in our friendship circles. And what happens if we're not careful is that our life becomes all about if I can just strive, succeed, ambition, go, 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 then life is going well. But the problem is that as we live that way, we talked about it last week, what does it end up with? It ends up with us chasing after something we can never get. And it creates this feeling of discontentment inside of us and this feeling of never enoughness. And what can happen so easily is that we're looking to our family, we're looking to our friends, we're looking to our workplace to fill something inside of us. And we're looking to them to say, am I good enough yet? Have I achieved enough? Have I sacrificed enough? Have I done enough yet? Or maybe in your life, it's just one person. Maybe there's one person in your life, if they just looked at you and said, you have done enough, we would feel satisfied. Maybe it's a stepdad or a father or a mother or a child or a sibling or a boss. There's just someone in your life that you just feel, if they looked at me and said, you have made it, would that be enough? And we get stuck, we get afraid that if I take my foot off the pedal, if I stop trying to go, then I'm going to fall behind. Now the question is, what are you going to fall behind on? I remember ages ago, I took some leave right before I left my job at Inglewood Community Church and came here to the associate position at Lesmere Baptist Church. And right as I was getting ready to transfer over, I said to someone I was talking to, one of my mentors at the time, I'm just a little bit afraid that when I stop and I don't keep going, that I'm not going to be doing what God wants me to do. And I had this fear inside of me. If I'm not succeeding, if I'm not up and to the right, if I'm not being successful, then what am I going to do? And they encouraged me and they said, look, it's like a treadmill. You're moving, and every now and then you need to just stop and step off the treadmill, and everything will keep going, and you'll step back in, and it will be fine. And so I stopped, I took a step to the side, we took some time off, and then as I stepped back into what was happening in my world at that moment, it was fine. In fact, it was a little bit of a hit to the ego, because no one went, we missed you, where were you, why weren't you here? They didn't say anything, they went, you're back. And we kept going. And that's what can happen, we get stuck thinking it's about ambition, achievement, and if we strive, then we're going to make it. And don't get me wrong, doing good things on earth is part of how I think God made us. But when that becomes why God made us, and that becomes the focus of why God made us, that's when we run into trouble. And eventually what happens if we live in that cycle of just succeed and strive, we will eventually wear out. And it will wear us down, and it will break the relationships that we need to sustain us. So when Jesus invites us to follow him, I love the fact that he chose the icon of the cross. He didn't choose a checkered flag. He didn't choose a sword. He didn't choose a gold medal or a crown or whatever. Those are the marks of ambition and succeeding, right? When God and when Jesus chose the icon of what would define him on earth, he chose the cross. The mark of death and humiliation. The mark of death and humiliation. Something which was meant to instill fear in people. Jesus turned around, took a hold of that and said, this is not actually going to represent life. What I loved in the video that we saw a second ago is that all around the world, when people see the symbol of the cross, they think people are here to help. And the reason they think people are here to help is because in the past, people who say, we love Jesus and we recognize the cross, they've been people who have helped other people. So to assume that following Jesus makes us powerless or weak, I think is not great. It's not a good way of looking at it. And we're going to look at today that the cross and choosing to embrace the way of the cross is actually how we experience the power of God. Because the invitation of the cross is an invitation to the approval of one and not everyone. The approval of one and not everyone. When God died and when Jesus died on the cross and he came back to life and he recentered the world around a new way of living, Jesus was saying, you don't live for yourself anymore. You don't live for everyone else anymore. You live for me. And some of you who say, I follow Jesus, your story has been all about, I tried this, and none of it worked. But then one day, a friend came and told me about Jesus, and everything seemed to line up. For some of us, our story has been from when I was a kid. I followed Jesus because when you're a kid, you do what your parents say and you move on, right? But then as life came along, you thought to yourself, I'm going to try some other stuff. Why do I have to just do what my parents taught me to do? I'm going to go out there, I'm going to live up my life. And you went for the approval of others through all sorts of things, and you found yourself going, that's not it. And you came back to, isn't it amazing to have God loving me and having someone and something to live for? So last week, to help us in this quest of not living for the approval of everyone, but living for the approval of God, I asked a question. Does anyone remember what the question is? Yes. So yeah, and somebody said over there, what would it look like to choose to lose? At the end of that, what would it look like choosing to actually lose in a particular situation? And this is a great question because it doesn't go, I'm not a part of that, right? It captures all of us. We all live lives where we want to be first. We all live lives where we get there first. We all live lives where we want to be the one that's a fuss made about. And Jesus comes along and says, I get all of that. And I was tempted by all of that. And I could have at any point in time demanded all of that. But I didn't. So he calls those of us that follow him to make a new way of living, and choosing to lose is a big way that we get to do that. Choosing to lose means not taking the credit for, it means not being the first person in the line. And it's so different to the way our culture thinks that when it happens, people do something that you may not be expected that they do, but they generally stop and go, wait a minute, that's not the script. That's not how you're meant to do it. And when you choose to lose in certain situations and say, I'm sorry first, even though there was no chance they were going to come and apologize to you, and you went, you know what, I've got to front foot this, I'm going to apologize first. Or in a situation where there's a disagreement and people go, you're in the right, you go, you know what, I'm actually going to let them go first because this matters more to them than it does to me. People stop and go, that's different. That's different. And some of you, personality-wise, a few of you get there on your own because your personality is to just choose to put other people first, but this is different to that. This is making the choice, regardless of your personality, regardless of your work, regardless of how you've come to be where you are today. It's a choice for all of us to go, I'm going to copy Jesus and put other people first. Even if it means admitting that I'm wrong. Even if it means asking forgiveness, though they will never ask for it as well. Even if it means owning more of the problem than I should, but it means restoring the relationship. What does that look like? So we asked that question, what does it look like to choose to lose? Because one of the things that I've experienced and seen around the place is that as life goes on, and as we get further away from Jesus' death and resurrection, what I found very interesting is that at the beginning, this idea of choosing to lose, being the least, following Jesus, washing feet, all that sort of stuff, the good things that people go, the cross is here to help because the people that come are helpful. The further we get away from that, the easier it is. The easier it is to start to minimize that way of living. And what happens over time is if we're not careful, the people who are meant to represent Jesus begin to look, act, and react like everybody else, but they've just included Jesus in there as well. And what I mean by that is that as time goes on, and you can see it in pop culture really easily, you look at pop culture and a few of the guys up there who are singing certain songs and doing certain things, and then they tack Jesus on the end like an afterthought. Like if I add the Jesus market, there's an extra bit of sales, or if I just add Jesus to this, then it's fine. And what happens is that as we begin to look, act, and react like the culture around us, the culture begins to look at us and go, well, why should I even bother following Jesus when you guys look like me? You behave like me. And when the church starts to behave like our culture, but we add in Jesus, we run into a little bit of a problem. Now, we're going to meet a guy called Paul who lived 2,000 years ago and says some stuff about this. And we're going to go, if you've got your Bibles, 1 Corinthians chapter 1. It'll be up on the screen in just a minute. But Paul was a man who lived 2,000 years ago, and he understood completely and was completely aware that the implications of the cross meant that we needed to change the way that we lived. So Paul was a guy who was the best at what he did. So anyone here who's the best at what you do? you're like Paul. So Paul was a guy who was living within the religious institution, and they valued obedience and they valued hard work. And Paul, he out-obeyed and outworked everybody, and he was very, very successful at what he did. But then one day, he met Jesus. And because he met Jesus, he got the opportunity to write half of the New Testament. And many things we do in our world have been impacted by what Paul wrote over 2,000 years ago, things that we may not even be aware of. So Paul was a man who began his life. He was about ambition, achieving, being the best. But when he met Jesus, he went to himself, this is not how we were actually designed to live. Paul realized Jesus wasn't an add-on. Paul realized the cross isn't a good luck charm. Paul realized, this is different, and this requires us to live different. And in fact, Paul recognized very quickly, it's going to require us to live the opposite way to our culture. It was an invitation to join the Losers Club. Because, to be honest, by first century standards, Jesus lost. He was dying on a cross. Even if he came back to life and that's what spread, he still was humiliated on the cross. But he lost on purpose with a purpose, and that purpose includes you and me. So Paul acknowledges up front that from the outside looking in, following Jesus and the cross is crazy. This is what he says. He says in 1 Corinthians 1 verse 18, for the message of the cross is foolishness. It's foolishness. It's silly for those who are perishing. The message of the cross is crazy. It's backwards. And for those that are fading away, they look at it and go, what do you mean to live means to give your life away? What do you mean the upside down kingdom of Jesus means putting other people first? What do you mean that to win, sometimes you actually have to choose to lose? It makes no sense. For those who live on the outside looking in at Jesus' message, it makes no sense. For those that cling to this life like all there is this life. For those that cling to this life of health, wealth, beauty, status, the things that eventually fade away, the cross looks ridiculous. Because the cross represents everything that those people who are perishing, who are clinging to those things, it represents everything that they resist. It represents their greatest fears of loss, of fading away, of falling behind, of becoming irrelevant. So Paul's point is that scrambling to reclaim or maintain what ultimately can't be claimed or maintained, that's foolishness. So he says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. It makes no sense. But to those who are being saved, it being the message of the cross, is actually the power of God. It's the power of God. For those looking in at the cross, at what it represents and what it calls people to live, it looks ridiculous. It looks like it will never work. But for those who are actually understanding and going, I think I get what Jesus is on about, it is how the power of God is unleashed. So for those who choose to say yes to the invitation of the cross, who choose to follow the way of Jesus, the way of others first, this is how we have God's power operate through us. So the invitation is to stop chasing what can't be caught. Stop clinging to the things that can't be kept. It's how and when we are transformed, when we get to participate in the kingdom of God and experience His power. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved is the power of God. And you and I know when we see it in action that it is something different. It's that stop and stare moments that you have. There's people in your life that have made decisions because they follow Jesus that you go, why did you do that? In the workplace, people have said no to promotions. People have said no to being put first. People have said no to things. And you go, why is that? In your life, there have been people who have put you first. And the reason they did that is because they love Jesus. There are people, for those of you who grew up in church, who gave up their weekends to serve you and put you first, even though they had a full week working in whatever environment they were working. They did that because they had experienced God and they wanted you to experience it as well. There's people this morning who are serving all around this building because they believe that the message of Jesus makes a difference and can make a difference in your life and in mine. It changed the world in the first century, but it is a repeated daily decision. So the way of the cross is where change begins, because that's when we live in sync with Jesus. That's when the Holy Spirit dwells in us. Now, I'm going to go to a very famous passage, part of the Bible where Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit. Now, the fruit of the Spirit is not the fruit of good behavior, just to put that out there. The fruit of the Spirit is not the fruit of, if you do these things, your employment will go well. The fruit of the Spirit is not, it's not those things. It's not about success, achievement, or ambition. The fruit of the Spirit is something which we refer to in church world, and we refer to, for those of you that read the Bible, it is the place where the change in our life, that's where we start to see things get produced in us. So the list is up here about what the fruit of the Spirit is. These are the things that happen in your life and my life when we say yes to the invitation of the cross. These are the things that happen in our lives that make us better people. If you're single and you're looking to date someone, you want someone who has this on their character list, right? If you're married to someone, you want a spouse who has this on their character list. As you raise your kids, you want your kids to be able to tick these off and be, my kid is all of these things. Because we recognize in other people that these are the things that produce the sort of people that we want to be around. And for those of us that follow Jesus, the work of the Spirit is to produce this in our lives. If you want the test for how you're going with God, how are you going with this stuff? It's just a little bit of a litmus test. So this is the thing that it should be produced in your life. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. But the thing is that these are all responses. These are things that we respond and that we grow in. And these responses, in my opinion, when the world looks at the way of the cross and they say it's foolishness, we say, no, it's powerful, because to be these things, to grow in these areas, is not weakness. It requires strength. It requires saying no to yourself. It requires reflecting. It requires you doing the hard work of recognizing that your upbringing is impacting your faith today. And you need to go back and figure out why that is. It requires the hard work of recognizing that in school, people said things to you and you took a hold of them, and now you're living out of some things that are not true. This is hard work because you recognize that there are people who have died that you will never have peace with, but they are impacting your peace. The fruit of the Spirit is something which is hard work. It is not, you don't fall into this. My experience, and hands up if you're different because I'd love to hear this, my experience is that when I go on Josh mode, is that I do worse at these things. I'm a worse husband, a worse parent, I'm a worse friend when I go and make it about me. And I find I have less peace, less joy, less love, less goodness. I have less when I try to put myself in the middle of that. One of the reasons I actually believe in God and that I still have a faith is because I look at how I live and I go, that's not because of who I am. Because I know when I put myself in the middle, I know where that leads me. And that does not lead me to good places. But when I center on my faith, on Jesus, on the way of the cross, on my friends and on my church community, these things start to be produced in my life. And that's the Holy Spirit working in me. So 2 verses later in 25, Paul actually writes, since we are living by the Spirit, we need to keep in step with the Spirit. And this is what the Spirit produces in us. So as we live and as we follow Jesus, what should be produced is this stuff. This stuff should be coming out. So this invitation of the cross to live in a different direction is something which is different to what everything else offers us. The world offers us, yes, you can follow Jesus as long as you add him on to what you're already doing. Culture says, yeah, sure, you can do what you want with your faith. It doesn't matter as long as you add it on to what you're doing. Your own selfish ambition, and if you look long enough in the mirror, you realize, I really want to do what I want to do. And the cross invites us to go, that is not a great plan. You can try and follow that, but talk to people who have tried that before. And if you've tried it in your own life, just remember how life was when that was the plan. We don't make the best decisions when we put ourselves in the center of our resources and our decision making. So this invitation of the cross is different. It's an invitation to live in step with the Spirit. It's an invitation for the Spirit to work through us and outwork these things in our lives. But when we don't, and when we fail, and when the church fails, people look at us and they go, they don't believe this. when the church doesn't live out these things, when the church doesn't take up the cross, when the church doesn't choose to live different to the culture around us, people look at us and they just conclude, well, Christianity is just a cover for people who want to do what they want to do. Like, they don't even believe what they are saying. They read a Bible that talks about a God who gives up his life, yet these guys at work only look out for themselves. They tell me about Jesus who's given them inner peace, yet in their family, I see the way they treat their kids. They talk about this God who saved them and who loves them, yet they're not very loving when I see them out on the sports field. And culture looks at people who proclaim one thing and do another, and they say they're just a bunch of hypocrites that just want to do their own thing, and they're going to use God as their holy excuse. When there's no difference, there's no power. And they notice that. And the world looks and says they're just using the same strategies, the same tactics as everybody else. And do you know who we lose when we live this way? The church loses the next generation every time. Whenever a church turns internally and whenever a church says we're going to live our own way and add Jesus at the end, the first thing they lose is the next generation. Those who don't yet follow Jesus are looking at people who follow Jesus and going, do you believe what you're saying? And we can say, hopefully, I don't get it right, but I believe it. I'm not perfect, but I'm following Jesus. But when we don't, and when we just pay lip service to faith, people look and go, you're just like everybody else. And the next generation walks away and doesn't want to be involved with what is happening. So back to Paul and what he says to his audience in Corinth. 1:20. He goes, where is the wise person? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of this world? And it's true, God has made foolish the wisdom of this world. And I'll give you one great example to make you all go, that's right. And some of you work in this industry, so you know exactly where I'm coming from. You probably could come up here, take the microphone, and give me a million examples of this. But when we live our life as though we're the center, when we live as though we're everything, we strive, we aim to succeed, we want the best job title, we want life to go our way. But what is it that's said at funerals? What is it that is said at funerals? I'll give you a hint. No one cares what your job title was. No one cares how great it was that you spent so much time at the office. When it comes to death, the final experience here on earth, we discover very quickly what actually truly matters and is worth pursuing. But the problem is, most of us just turn a blind eye, and yes, we understand it, but we don't want to live that way. So what do we celebrate at a funeral? Do we celebrate winning or serving? Serving. Do we celebrate achievement or character? Do we celebrate what they clung to or what they gave? Do we celebrate what they fought to preserve or how they came to the defense of other people? In the end, we all know what truly matters and what we celebrate again and again and again. And all the funerals I've been to, what is celebrated above all things is selflessness. There is clarity in those moments. The value of a life is measured by how much of it is given away. But for some reason, when we've got our health and our well-being, we don't live like that's the case. We celebrate it at the end, but then we don't intentionally live that way in the meantime. So, to the world, God makes foolish the wisdom of the world. He says, you live like there's only you and no one else, yet when you get to the end, you celebrate how they lived and what they gave away. If you're chasing the wind, and you're chasing success, and you're chasing and striving and doing everything you can to live for today, the cross shows us that that is foolishness. So, if you want to experience the power of God in your life, let's have a look at where God actually gave his power. When Jesus was walking the earth, he performed miracles. Now, Jesus could at any time have performed miracles for himself and done what he wanted to do, but that's not what he wanted to do. When Jesus was being questioned and they were saying to him, go on, prove that you really are the Son of God, he just stayed quiet and allowed them to do what they needed to do. And eventually, when he died on Golgotha, when he was nailed to the cross, at any point in time, Jesus could have used his power to do whatever it is that he wanted. And he didn't. And in that moment, it was the ultimate loss that actually unleashed the ultimate power in this world. So if you want to experience the power of God in your life, then we do it by losing, by putting ourselves second, by elevating others, by giving our lives away. That's how we experience the power of God. And don't get this confused, it's not a passive, lazy thing. I mean, if you want a case study, and you go to the book of Acts and you look at the life of Paul, he lived this way, and that guy was not lazy. He went through everything and did a bunch of stuff. So it's not lazy and about being passive or just passing on things. The cross is an invitation to leverage your talent and your opportunities to the fullest for the glory of the King who loves you and who invited you to follow him. So the message of the cross is foolishness for those who are perishing. But for those who are being saved, it is actually the power of God. So we're going to leave that there for today. So to give you a bit of application, we're going to revisit the same question we visited last week. And I can't answer the question for you because it's contextual. But what would choosing to lose look like for you? If God is inviting us, all of humanity, to embrace the way of the cross, to live life differently, to live others first, to put people before yourself, if that's what the cross invites us to do, when you have a disagreement this week at work, at school, at home, what would it look like to choose to lose? Yes, you were there first. I get that. Yes, you're right. I understand that completely. Yes, it's their fault. 100%. But God doesn't give us the opportunity to leverage that and lord it over him, over the other person. Jesus actually says, if I was in your shoes, by the way, if I was in your shoes, and you can look at what I did to fact check me on this, but if I was in your shoes, I would choose to lose in that situation. And yes, it's not fair. It wasn't fair when I died. Yes, I get it. If Jesus was in our shoes, remember the bands back in the day? What would Jesus do? Where'd they go? They went somewhere, probably landfill. But what would Jesus do? If he was you, he would choose to lose. When Jesus was tempted to use his power, he chose not to. When Jesus was accused of wrongdoing and he was not wrong, he chose to stay silent. When Jesus was nailed to the cross and invited to do something about that, to walk off the cross and to take control of the world, he said no. No, because I'm doing something bigger and better. I'm choosing to lose so that future generations can know that God loves them. So if you follow Jesus, choosing to lose is a part of how we've been invited to live. So what would it look like to choose to lose in your situation?